Yes, we're ready. Hello, and thank you to everyone who's joined us in this hybrid session. We have several attendees in person, and we have several people online. I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for this training session. A special thank you to the Appalachian Regional Commission for partially funding this grant-funded opportunity, the Corning Foundation, which made the ARC grant possible, as well as New York State Department of State trainers, and all of you who've come out tonight. The little introduction that I'm providing here is a brief overview of some of the local governments that serve Steuben, Schuyler, and Chemung counties, and how those local government services relate to the general public. The residents of Steuben, Schuyler, and Chemung County are served by approximately 126 local governments and 295 other semi-governmental organizations. Now, those are organizations that have their board members elected by members of the local government. The breakdown of local governments is in the following way: 3 counties, 3 cities, 52 towns, 21 villages, 18 school districts, and 29 fire districts. How this relates to the people of our community is that each of those elected, appointed, or nonprofit board has to be guessed by individuals from our community. So if there's 190,000 residents in our area approximately, and then there's 126 elected boards with at least 5 members each, 634 nonprofit boards with approximately 7 members each, and then thousands of potential committees throughout the region with 5 to 10 members each on the committee. That's approximately 7,000 to 17,000 available positions that local people from our community can serve their local governments and other nonprofits at any given time. I'm really happy with this little diagram that you may see here. People serve on boards, and boards serve the people. And if we can provide training opportunities like this to make residents of our community feel more confident to serve on these boards, then I think we can have an overall benefit for everyone. Residents can be appointed to boards like the Ethics Board, the Zoning Board, the Planning Board, Assessment Board, Historic Review Board, or a variety of committees for their local government, and facilities, event planning committees, HR committees for nonprofit organizations as well. As part of our current program, we're discussing how board service is an employment opportunity, and that individuals who are participating in board service are gaining valuable skills, and we're working with employers in the region so that those employers will recognize the skills and experience that are gained by people serving on a board, and those board volunteers also benefit from learning more about their community, gaining experiences, and then having a new skill set around compliance, conflict resolution, and public policy. So far, our program has been running for about a year. We had outreach efforts in February, March, April, June, and July. We had a training for 18 people in April and 23 people in July. So far, 2 individuals have been placed on 2 boards or committees, and we're seeking 22 more individuals to undergo preliminary training. Some of those people are listening to this session right now. Thank you. And we will assist with suggesting board placements and seating new board members. If you have any interest in this program, please reach out to us. You can contact anyone at the office or email us. Thank you very much. And again, my name is Victoria Ehlen from Southern Tier Central Regional Planning and Development Board. Our website is stcplanning.org. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass it off to the New York State trainers who are going to provide us some detailed information about skills that make great board members.
Great. I feel like I needed to see those slides because I often don't really think about how many governments there are out there, and then if everybody has a planning board, that's a lot of people that we require to do a lot of work across New York State. So I wish we were there in person. My name's Paula Gilbert. I'm joined by Monica Ryan, and we are local government specialists in the Division of Local Government Services at the New York Department of State. It's a lot of words. Basically, what we're here to do is we are planners by education. So most of the work that we do is training planning and zoning board members. They need 4 hours of training every year, and we're typically the people who do that. We also provide a variety of technical assistance to board members and local officials across the state as well. So if you find during your service that you have, a question about and you're not quite sure, or situation that you're not quite sure how to go about, you can always reach out to us for free advice. So we are literally here. So utilize us when you feel that you're in a situation where you might need some assistance. So this course, Skills That Make Great Board Members, was something that actually grew out of one of our county planners asking us to come up with something because she was struggling to also find board members in her county. And she felt like because a lot of times a lot of people are lay people and aren't land use experts who sit on this board, she was like, can you come up with something that kind of goes over just some of the basic skills that you might need to have when you sit on these boards? And luckily it kind of came together as this course, and it's been requested a lot during COVID, but it's now seems like it's having kind of a revival now thanks to Victoria starting, but other counties all of a sudden want us to come out and do that as well. So so basically this one, it's just a lot of going over what, if you decide to be a land use board member, some of the stuff that you're going to see. It's also somewhat applicable if you decide to run for public office, like be a town board member, but yeah, so it's a little bit of everything. So feel free to ask us questions in the chat box as we go along. We'll try to answer them, and we'll get started. So welcome to the board. Thank you for volunteering your time. The most important thing to remember is New York is a home rule state, which means essentially when it comes to issues of local government governance, it's really up to the local level to decide how to regulate their own government. So the power to regulate land is at the local level. And really, especially if you're coming to be a planning or a zoning board member, the decisions you make have a long and lasting impact on your community. So it's an important job, and it can also be kind of a bit intimidating as well because there's a lot to know, but we're always looking for people who want to see the best in your community, and most likely you're volunteering your time because you see the importance of why you love your community and sharing that with others through your service. So an effective board member knows the authority of the board that they sit on and its duties, the standards for decision making by the board, the legal aspects of your board conduct, including bylaws if you have them, and your rules of procedure. Hopefully you have both of those. It can be really helpful when you're first coming on the board. Your regulations and laws and plans that are applicable to your board. So things, if you're sitting on a land use board, things like the comprehensive plan. If you have zoning, your subdivision regulations, site plan review, special use permit, etc. And then things like how to read and interpret plans and maps, because you'll be seeing a lot of those, what we do when we conduct site visits, where to seek that assistance when you have questions, and really what's happening in your community, the local planning and development trends, because everything is super local. And the point of this slide is land use control is one of the most, if not the most important function of local government. It can be extremely highly controversial in some communities. And it's also typically what we see most out of our local media, because people often have really big feelings about development in their community. So typically this is what your local reporters are going to be asking about. So on the right, it's just some of the headlines that I pulled out of the Capital Region where we are. So things like the Skodak Zoning Board is taken to court over the Stewart's project. Saratoga Planning Board okays controversial zoning near the hospital. So things like that. You're going to see a lot of news coverage usually in the course of your service. So who are the players on the local government team? And it usually starts with those that work in maybe town hall all the time, and then those who kind of serve and work around it. So the municipal clerk is important because they're like the file keeping czar. They kind of keep track of filing and posting of meetings, and they might be doing things like pulling together the minutes and posting that on your website or posting projects on your website. Your board secretary, hopefully you have one, they might be receiving applications and starting to put together your agenda, checking to make sure that applications are complete so that the board is ready to work when they get to the meeting. They probably support your offer some administrative support. Then there's your code and zoning enforcement officer. If you have zoning, you have to have a zoning board of appeals and a zoning enforcement officer. All municipalities have a code enforcement officer. In most municipalities, especially in rural places, that person wears the same hat. So they are both the code and zoning enforcement officer. So they do all the enforcement of the building code, Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code in New York State. They also make those initial determinations in zoning that gets work over to the Zoning Board of Appeals. If you're lucky to have a lot of resources, you might have a planner or a planning department at your disposal. The more rural, smaller communities don't tend to have planners. It's unfortunately hard to usually find a person to do that, especially if you don't have a lot of development pressure happening in your community. But most of the cities do have a planning department or a couple of staff planners. They often provide professional and technical support to those boards, and they might be doing a little bit of what the board secretary or municipal clerk might be doing as well. You may have municipal counsel for legal support, so you might have a town attorney, and they might be able to help you, or maybe you have a town attorney that's on retainer that helps you through things, and that's the same for the municipal engineer who might be looking at, subdivision approvals that are coming through, just to make sure that everything is good. And then, of course, the head honcho, the chief administrator, and that's typically, if you're in a city, it's a mayor, in a village, it's a mayor, and if you're in a town, it's a town supervisor. So they may be around full-time, or they might actually only be around part-time as well. So it depends on how your own municipality is set up. So the primary functions of the local governing board is really twofold. It's mostly legislative because the New York State Constitution grants local governments pretty fairly broad home rule powers to really adopt their own laws, their own local laws over various subjects. And then there's the police power, which provides local governments a way of providing for public order, for peace, and really to protect the health, safety, and general welfare of its residents. So a lot of our local laws that we see around land use development are using the police power. And then they adopt their local laws. So if you have a comprehensive plan, your legislative boards or your village board of trustees or your town board are the people to adopt your comprehensive plan. And then if you decide to go with zoning, they would adopt that afterwards. On the other side, they have administrative tasks, which is supervisory, so they oversee everybody who works for the municipality. They have budgetary functions where they have to come up with a budget every year. They oversee contracts, so if you go into, if you get grants and contracts, typically your governing board is overseeing those. And for the land use board members, the most important is the appointive. They appoint members to sit on planning and zoning boards. So that gives you just kind of the really quick overview of what your local governing board is up to. Then we have the planning board, who has both advisory and regulatory powers. The nice part about being on a planning board is the advisory function. So they have the authority to advise on all planning and land use related municipal activities in the municipality, whether they're asked or not. So that's pretty cool. So usually they're the ones that are looking at your comprehensive plan and might be telling the governing board, hey, it might be our plan is 15 years old or 20, and maybe it's time, and we're experiencing a lot of change, maybe a large employer is leaving, so maybe we should think about updating our comprehensive plan. That is easily something that a planning board can recommend. They also can be asked for their opinion on variance requests from the Zoning Board of Appeals, and then they have additional powers that are assigned to them by the governing board. And then we have the regulatory side of the house, and state statute gives subdivision regulation power to members of the planning board. So that is specifically done in state statute, but it's also things like site plan review, where you're overseeing the development of one parcel, or special use permits, usually is given to you by your governing board. Sometimes those go to zoning boards, but for the most part, I think most municipalities give those three functions to the planning board. And then the primary function of our Zoning Board of Appeals, if you have zoning, they are quasi-judicial, which means that applicants have to appeal decisions of the zoning enforcement officer to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So it always begins with your zoning enforcement officer. They make a determination if a project goes along with the zoning. That's great, then they can proceed. But if they need some kind of relief because you require 10 feet of setback and you only have 8 feet of setback, then you're going to have to appeal to the Zoning Board of Appeals for an area variance for that 2 extra feet of relief. So zoning boards always have appellate jurisdiction. That means that they are interpreting your zoning regulations because your zoning enforcement officer reads the law as it is. They don't have enough wiggle room to offer some creative interpretations of the law. That's what the board is supposed to come up with themselves. And then if you do need variances, they issue or deny those appeals for the variances. And like I said in the previous slide, some of them have original jurisdiction. It's granted to them by the governing board, and most of the time we see that in special use permits or site plan review. All right, I think I've talked for enough for a bit, so I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Monica, who will tell you a little bit about the comprehensive plan.
All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for hopping on tonight or coming in to see Victoria. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the fundamental planning and zoning documents and plans that, as board members, you should be familiar with. Hopefully, you have some of these in your community. More than likely, you have at least one or both of these as part of your function. And so the first we're going to talk about is the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan, as Paula mentioned briefly earlier, is considered really to be the heart and soul of planning in local communities. It is recognized in statute as the fundamental planning initiative that a community can undertake. Here on the screen we have citations within statute related to the comprehensive plan. And in there you will find some language that discusses the importance of the comprehensive plan, provides guidance on what a comprehensive plan can include, and the fact that it is the driving force behind land use decisions, including zoning. But what it doesn't tell you is anything specific that you have to have in your plan. So it really can be whatever your community wants it to be. And they do come in all shapes and sizes. There is a process for developing the plan that is spelled out in statute that does need to be followed, whether it's a first plan or an update. But for the most part, there's it really is up to each individual community. But fundamentally, it is an outline for land use decision-making, orderly growth and development decisions, policies and programs. It can include recommendations regarding infrastructure and other community services. Over time, I think the comprehensive plan has broadened to cover almost all aspects of what is considered a healthy community. So really, you could find almost anything in a comprehensive plan. So for you as board members, if you're new board members, I would certainly inquire if you haven't been given a copy of your community's comprehensive plan. It is possible that you don't have one. There are still, some communities throughout the state that don't, or it could be even that it's quite old. It's possible that nobody knows where it is and can't locate one in a file, but hopefully that's not the case. So please do acquaint yourself with your comprehensive plan if you have one, because you should be using it as a guiding document for your decision making as board members as well. And that goes for the planning board, the zoning board of appeals, the local governing board, and other committees and organizations within your community. So the typical elements considered in a comprehensive plan cover everything from land use and growth patterns, demographics, community character, preservation considerations, whether that's natural resource protection or historic preservation, the adequacy of infrastructure, sewer, water, if you have natural gas, whether or not you have good cell coverage. These are all considerations, particularly rural considerations. And it can be other things such as community services, contemplating whether or not you have the services to provide for all of your community members, aging population, et cetera. Economic development, housing, that's becoming more and more of a talking piece because we are facing all across New York State skyrocketing housing prices and housing shortages, natural resource protection, and then resilience is becoming also a really important emerging topic. It's not really an emerging issue, but it's newer to plans as they're getting updated, because with climate change and more extreme weather events, we really do need to start thinking about how we're developing land and where we're considering growth and development, and where we need to reconsider existing growth or existing development, given all of the impacts that we've had from storms. So all of these topics are covered, and typically there is a community profile that touches on these topics and sort of sets out where you are today as a community, maybe where you've come from, and providing some projections. And then you use that information, which is in the form of an existing conditions document or community profile, and you develop typically a vision statement and goals for where you want to be in the future, where you want your community to, what is that preferred future, and what are the goals that you wish to achieve. And then it's rounded out by a series of recommendations for how to get there. And so some plans, when they need updating, really need to just update how we're going to get there, because maybe the goals haven't changed and the vision hasn't changed, but over time you have to think differently about how to get there. And so as board members, you're going to look at that vision and goals and think about whether projects are going to meet those when you're looking at those plans. Because you can use the comprehensive plan, as we like to say, as either a sword or a shield in defending your decisions. If you've are looking at an application and you are concerned about the aesthetics of it, or the fact that it is very auto-oriented in the middle of your pedestrian-friendly downtown with a sea of parking and a difficult situation for pedestrians to cross across the property, and it really doesn't look like its surroundings and is going to impact the character. You can utilize the goals in your plan, if it talks about those things, to defend decisions to ask the developer to make some changes to what is proposed, to deny some elements of what's in a proposal, et cetera. And you can use it to back up decisions if you're challenged in court. You know, there is more to it than that, and if you have zoning and other standards to help you with being able to back up your decisions, that's always very helpful, but it is there to help you, and it's also there to remind you of what you're supposed to want for your community. And then as a practical matter, as board members, you should be using the comprehensive plan more than maybe lay people in your community, so therefore you're aware of when plans may start to lose direction for you. Maybe some elements aren't included and you're seeing things going on in an area of your community that the comprehensive plan didn't really address the way you think things are evolving, and maybe it's time to update that plan. So you might be in one of the best positions to know when a plan really does need to be updated, and hopefully you'll use that knowledge and you'll communicate that to your local governing board so that they can, you know, get to work to figure out a way to get a plan update underway. So it's a practical skill or it's a practical matter to understand your plan, but it also, you are one of the technicians that uses the plan the most. So if your plan is reaching 5 to 10 years old or more, we would recommend at least revisiting your comprehensive plan at least every 3 to 5 years, not necessarily to update it, but just to make sure it's still working for you. And then at the 5 to 10 year mark, it is a good idea to try to update your plan. The more frequently you update them, the less of a big deal it is, because you're sort of keeping up with things. So you may have even, you're supposed to actually have a statement in the plan, and this comes out of statute, that gives a time frame during which your comprehensive plan should be updated, whether it's every 3 to 5 years, or should be reviewed. So that should be actually in the back of any comprehensive plan. But whether it is or not, they shouldn't just sit on a shelf, and they certainly should be utilized and updated as necessary. So the other fundamental land use tool that you may have, and again, not every community has zoning, but if you are in a community with zoning, then you will need to understand how your zoning works. Even if you're not doing the interpreting of your zoning, it's not necessarily your job, you should still have a fundamental understanding of how your zoning works. The first thing to remember is that zoning must be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So if you have done a comprehensive plan update, we would say then the next step might be updating zoning. If you have zoning and you're worried about your zoning and you think it might need changes, we would always recommend updating your comprehensive plan first, because they do need to be consistent. But so fundamentally, zoning originated with the idea of land use regulations to help avoid incompatible land uses. That was always the fundamental idea behind zoning. That still exists today, but I would say that what is considered incompatible has changed considerably, and there is a lot more interest in mixed-use communities, mixed-use neighborhoods. Not everywhere, but there is certainly a change in what defines compatibility. And zoning, therefore, has changed in how it views compatibility. and regulations really have evolved over time. But fundamentally, it still is about regulating land use, density, and the placement of structures on sites. And many codes actually go into other areas to sort of round out land use regulations. And then working with zoning is also subdivision regulations, which are separate because that's more about the, but works in conjunction with zoning, and that's the subdivision of land into additional lots. And then, of course, site plan review, which you might have without having zoning, is also a separate process for reviewing development, whether or not you have zoning. So you can have site plan review and subdivision and not zoning, or you can have just site plan or just subdivision. It's really up to the discretion of the local community. As Paula said earlier, it is adopted by the local governing board, as are any updates to zoning. So like the comprehensive plan, we would say that as the technicians that use zoning the most, along with your zoning enforcement officer, you are in the best position to know when your regulations aren't working well. If you are opening up your laws and you are regularly having to deal with language that is unclear, then you should note passages that you find unclear. If you're on the Zoning Board of Appeals and you're seeing a lot of interpretations or variance applications, and you're approving a lot of those variances, maybe there's something about your code that could be tweaked to avoid all those variances. Sometimes it's about lot sizes and step backs, and some things just don't work. There was a trend for about a decade or more of suburban codes in villages and cities that really didn't speak to what was going on the ground, and so you had a lot of regulations that didn't actually weren't very consistent with the actual community development patterns. So those should be taken care of over time. You know, you shouldn't just leave those in place. Maybe there's terminology that's not included, definitions are missing. Again, you will be in a good position to know whether these things are working for you. Keep a running list of things that don't work. That way, when your community is ready to do an update, you have a nice running list of things that you'd like to fix, so that you can hit the ground running on a zoning update, because whoever's going to help you on that is going to be reliant on you to provide some of that information. So these are all good things to take on as board members once you get, as you're working with these documents in your community. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Paula, if I can do this.
Okay. So the next kind of section is just some of the maybe practical and some of the personal skills that you might need to have when you sit on your board. So the first is our personal interaction skills. I always like to tell new board members one of the most first important things I tell them is, don't be afraid to ask questions. This job, sitting on land use boards, is difficult, and it takes many years to sometimes feel even comfortable sometimes. We've definitely come across zoning board members that have sat on their municipal zoning board for over 50 years and tell me that I'm still learning all the time. So, we definitely want people to feel comfortable understanding the projects before the board. And maybe other board members have those same questions, but they might be a little bit more timid to ask them. So I would say, don't ever be afraid to ask some questions. Also, when it comes to working with applicants that appear before your board, sometimes it's best to be clear and direct with, one, each other as board members, but also with your applicants. Because the applicants typically appreciate it if your regulations really hold them to a high standard. And what I mean on this one is really this third bullet, which is sometimes applications have maybe little chance in passing as they're proposed. So it's often best for, land use board members to be rather upfront with them about your concerns so that either the changes can be proposed early in the process, or sometimes an applicant's going to choose to withdraw their application. That certainly has happened in a lot of municipalities where they didn't realize, like, hey, you might be on the hook for a pretty intensive seeker process, and so sometimes applicants say, you know what, maybe I need to reconfigure this, or maybe it's time to consider just withdrawing in general. So, so don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't feel like you have to hold back. Sometimes new members are kind of told by other members, like, oh, don't worry about it, just do what I do. But really, the purpose of having 3 or 5 or 7 members on these boards is really to have a variety of opinions and viewpoints. So that's why you work to come to a consensus on whether a project's going to go one way or the other. It's important to have those different viewpoints shared within the board itself. I wish I didn't have to say this, but, as a planning or zoning board member, you are a public officer, so of course you want to conduct yourself in an ethical manner. Promoting confidence and trust is really crucial when it comes to conducting the public's business. You don't want to be known as the board that's doing the bulk of your work behind closed doors and not really open to the public. It just, once you kind of are known as a municipality that maybe takes a little bit advantage of executive sessions, like, that stain is hard to shake off once it's there. So make sure that you're disclosing any, actual apparent or maybe even potential conflicts of interest pertaining to any of the applications or work before your board. As we say that, it's really not whether there is a conflict, but whether there might be. So sometimes this is difficult and there's no real black and white. We kind of work sometimes in shades of gray. So some of those potential conflicts might be business ties. Perhaps you have a realtor on your board. If they are representing an applicant that's also coming before a board, there's a business tie there, so there would be a conflict of interest. But sometimes it's family. Like, sometimes you feel like, it might be your son or daughter's house and they're coming before the board. That could be a conflict of interest. So when they do arise, that's okay. It's good to make it clear. The earlier you can, the better. And then that allows us to consider having alternates that might serve for recused members. That's what state statute has. Like, alternates can serve for conflicts of interest only. However, you can supersede state law to have alternates for other absences, like people are sick or they can't make the meeting, and you're going to use an alternate instead. You just supersede state statute for that. So no hard and fast test. Don't solicit or receive gifts either directly or indirectly. A Foxy developer might send town hall a gift basket. You don't want that to happen, but sometimes this stuff happens. Don't accept anything more than like a tchotchke that you receive at a conference. That's fine. But yeah, so usually most municipalities have a code of ethics. They may have an ethics board. If you do, they're the place to go to for questions and for help when you have these issues arise. And then there's ex parte communications. And that's when you're serving as a board member and you're contacted outside a meeting concerning a pending issue before the board. And this is sometimes really hard to do because as a public officer, you're serving the community that you live in. So it's hard when you are active in your own community and people know that you sit on the board. They might be pulling you aside to say, hey, I saw the application for the site plan down on you know, on Main Street, like, what do you think is going to happen about that? How do you feel, you know, I don't think that's maybe the best thing. It's hard to kind of draw that line where you're like, I can't have ex parte communications. It's not illegal to have them, but if you do have them, the best case scenario is to just disclose the contact on the record and really try to avoid discussing applications with, you know, fellow board members outside of the meetings. Definitely don't do it by email. Really, the email about the board should be receiving the packet for the materials for the meeting and then asking, are you going to be able to make the meeting, yes or no? So that gives everybody an idea if you're going to need to line up alternates or not. Other than that, really try to keep the email to nothing else besides that. So you can always email us for like questions on a specific, you know, question that you have about maybe a specific part of the law, but really try not to do the public's business like outside the public meeting. So then we have, I think Monica's going to take us through the maps, plats, and plans section.
Thanks, Paula. So reading maps, plats, and plans is going to be a skill that any board member for a planning and zoning board are going to have to develop probably pretty quickly because they are a fundamental element to almost any application. On some level, you will be dealing with some map, plat, or plan. Because they, you know, for obvious reasons, that is the way to convey a lot of site-related information. So it is something you're going to utilize all the time. And so I would recommend that if you are new to a board, there are a lot of resources online that can teach you about some of these types of maps and plats, and we'll talk about a couple of them just to give you a sense of them. But there are a lot of resources out there to learn how to read some of this stuff because it's not necessarily intuitive, and there are different ways to utilize, to develop these plats and maps. We would recommend that you remember that over time, anything that you refer to in an application that's going to become part of the record or part of the decision and part of that development approval that you may be looking at, you will want to be able to refer back to the specific maps themselves because records can get dispersed and fall out of a file and get into a different file. So having that last plan with the last revised date, the name of the map, and some way of indicating which version is the one that you're referring to is always important. It doesn't matter what kind of map it is, because things do you know, find their way out of files. So the first type of map is your basic, what's fancy name, planimetric maps. That's all of your, any two-dimensional map. So road maps, Google Earth, Google Maps, maps showing streets, building footprints, anything that's got a horizontal position feature from the Earth's surface, so you're just looking down on something, that's considered a planimetric map. They are used to provide context, to provide even highly detailed information that can be found on surveys. So it really is the fundamental map that you most often will be working with. And then zoning maps, you will want to understand how to read a zoning map and understand what's on a zoning map and what isn't on a zoning map. So zoning maps divide your community into zoning districts, and then those zoning districts provide information for that area with regard to land use, density, and other site development characteristics. And hopefully they follow either, those boundaries follow either property boundary lines or other physical features like streets or streams or something natural to divide an area. But that's not always the case. They can split property lines. Some zoning maps are really old and haven't been developed using GIS, geographic information systems, to create really clear digital maps. So you might still be working with, you know, if you're in a community with an older map, you may still be using one that's a bit harder to read. Your zoning enforcement officer is tasked with interpreting your zoning map. And if they have any questions, they can ask the Zoning Board of Appeals to interpret the map. And there should be text in your local zoning that discusses how to interpret boundaries if parcels are split by a zoning district. There's text in your zoning that should cover that issue and how to then use the zoning for that purpose. And there might also be text language about certain zoning districts that are hard to represent on a map because of their scale or maybe because they split parcels. So it's important to actually read the zoning district establishment language in your code and not just rely on the map itself, because some zoning districts will specifically say it's located, you know, along Main Street from the center line of Main Street to 1,000 feet back or 500 feet back from that center line. So now you know, regardless of what's on that map, you have to look further at a detail to really know where those boundary lines are. This will be something that the Zoning Board of Appeals might need to really understand because they may be tasked with helping a zoning enforcement officer interpret a map. But you should just the thing to keep in mind is not to completely rely on the visual of that map and look to the text of the zoning to make sure there isn't additional information that really spells out where those boundaries are. And tax maps, these are very commonly used to provide context and some other information related to a site plan. They are really a good tool to include for context, but what we like to caution, because they show roads, property, parcels, it's a really quick way to get a sense of acreage and lot frontages and density in a neighborhood, finding right-of-ways and easements. So they can provide a lot of really good quick context. The one thing we do caution is that they shouldn't be used in as a replacement for a survey for citing a project. Applicants might want to blow up that tax map and then, you know, draw in a little box on their tax map and say, here's where I'm going to locate my my garage. That shouldn't be utilized for that purpose. And in fact, because tax maps do sometimes estimate information based on, may estimate information for some parcels based off surveyed information on other parcels. So they're scaling off information. So you could actually have some pretty incorrect information on a tax map related to lot frontage or acreage that might really matter when you're thinking about subdivisions or variances and things of that nature. So those shouldn't be relied on because the information just simply may not always be correct. If something hasn't been surveyed and filed with the county anytime recently, it can be fairly inaccurate. So use them for what they're good for, but not for really the detailed site plans or subdivisions or variance applications that you're looking at. And then survey plats, of course, this is the workhorse of all applications. A plat is developed by a licensed surveyor. In New York State, there must be a licensed surveyor in New York State, and an official survey is stamped and signed by that surveyor. So that's what you should be looking for in any submission. They do use deed descriptions to identify meets and bounds on that property. It provides all kinds of measurements, existing site conditions, including natural features and buildings, roads, easements, all kinds of information. So it really is the one plat that you will need to really understand. For almost any review, you'll at some point you'll need to understand how to read surveys. There are a lot of resources out there to understand reading surveys. I will say that surveyors, there are some things that they can each do differently. Some use color, some put aerials underneath, some use slightly different ways of notations. So if you are in a community where there's a wide variety of surveyors, you might have to actually learn to review a lot of different stylistic differences in survey plats. But some things are typically consistent across different surveys. If you are given an old survey, don't be afraid to ask for a new one, because a lot of things can change on that site that aren't noted. It could be missing wells, septic, buildings, things could be removed from the site. There may be easements that have been added. And then it's not that uncommon that a really old survey might not even be accurate. And surveys over time follow the information from a previous survey. And so there can be inaccuracies that, if there isn't an update, may have been corrected by the neighboring parcel, but haven't caught up to the parcel before you. So they are expensive, and you'll feel bad asking for a new one, but it's really important to have all the right information. So you can't feel bad about it. You have to make sure you have the accurate information when you're looking at an application. All right, so Paula.
All right, so subdivision plats, and subdivision is the division of a parcel of land into a number of lots, blocks, or sites as specified in your local law that have with or without streets or highways for the purposes of sale, transfer of ownership, or development. In a lot of communities that are already completely built out, you might not, so like pretty busy villages, you might not see that many subdivisions, but if you're in a more rural town, you might see more of these. This, again, is specifically given to the planning board, but if you are on a zoning board of appeals, there might be minor area variances that are needed, so you might also see a subdivision plat. So the map of a subdivision is called a plat. They typically have all different sorts of information. Again, like Monica was saying, even like a regular survey plat with utilities, easements, things like that. For those who mostly sit on planning boards, they typically do site plan review. So subdivision is for numerous lots. Site plan is really there for the proposed use of a single parcel of land. So these sometimes, depending on your municipality, could be a little bit more like informal, but it really depends on usually how intensive the development of the parcel is going to be. So another important thing to keep in mind, because site plan review, you're held to the elements in your own local law. We always like to say it's sometimes helpful to have a checklist. So things like, you just want to make sure of your elements are there. So things like water and wells and sewer and parking and sidewalks, what it looks like on the parcel. Those are things, if you are required to look them over, you want to make sure that you're actually doing that drainage, transportation, and traffic flow, things like that. So again, they can get pretty complicated depending on the type of development that's happening before you, but typically it's a skill that you'll learn more as you sit on the board and see more of these come before you. Then my favorite from like 7th grade geography, the topographic map. You might see some of these. They just show you elevations depicted as lines. The closer the lines are, the steeper the slope. An important thing to keep in mind about subdivision is we don't want to see the subdivision into unbuildable parcels. So if you happen to have a subdivision plat that comes before you, you happen to notice that there's a lot of steep slopes, you're really going to want to try to discourage any development on those steep slopes and kind of move the lines around so that you're developing on better land that won't be subject to like erosion down the line. So that's topographic maps. Another important one to think about is the SEEKR process, the State Environmental Quality Review Act. We do this with the Environmental Assessment Form Mapper. This is something that your applicant should come to you with, the Part 1 filled out, but there is a mapper that really helps do that for you, so you can kind of punch in the property there. It kind of helps figure out some of the questions of Part 1. It kind of tells you some of the issues that might be there. So I always laugh when I'm in public or when I'm doing this with people. We always kind of have a laugh about the northern long-eared bat. It's an endangered species. It seems like it's across most of upstate New York. So this SEEKR EAF mapper can be really helpful flagging those kinds of endangered species that are around. So SEEKR, again, is just an environmental, it's an information gathering process about the environment and the development impact on the environment. So let this really help you fill out those forms and double check that the information that you're receiving from your applicants is correct. There's tons of mapping resources out there. Usually I say for most municipalities, I think, don't really have GIS at their disposal. If you do, that's great. But usually your county does. So your county websites might actually have really important information about, tax maps, aerials, property information. There is the GIS Clearinghouse at New York State, and we also, our colleagues in the Office of Planning and Development at DOS have the GIS Gateway. It's often usually something that you talk about with your county planners if you need something specific. All right, I'm going to send it back over to Monica to talk about preparing for the meetings.
All right, so now looking at preparing for the meetings themselves and just things to look for and keep in mind as board members. If you're new to your board, your board might have rules, localized rules and procedures for how meetings are conducted, duties and of officers, how agendas are set, who takes care of meeting minutes. You may have a process for public hearings and other things of that nature. Not all boards have these, and if they are in existence, hopefully they are in a local law or ordinance, because for them to be binding, that they really do need to be adopted by your local governing board. Not to say that boards themselves can't put together bylaws and vote on those and approve those, but they don't have the same weight of law that they would be if they're in a local or ordinance. And once they are codified like that, they will carry over from board to board a lot more easily. So we would recommend that they be developed that way. It's a good idea to ask your board, if you're new or somebody at the staff level, whether or not these procedures do exist, because then that will give you a sense of how meetings are run, and hopefully they're being utilized by your board. I will honestly say a lot of boards might not even know if such rules or procedures were developed. They might have been developed years ago. They could have, they could have been something locally adopted by the governing board and not readily available, so that's also a possibility. We do have examples if you're interested in putting those together. If there are folks on that are thinking that would be a good idea, we do have examples of that we could certainly send you. But you know, hopefully there's a consistency to how your board is run, because that really sets a tone. And it sets a tone for the applicants as well. Also, if there are things in those procedures that applicants need to know, like that applications have to be submitted 2 weeks prior to the next meeting, or if there is a process for public hearings that community members would like to know, all of that could be provided in advance and keep communication open. So we would recommend checking with your board to see if those rules exist, and then familiarize yourself with them. There is also the procedure that you will need to follow for individual applications, whether it's the rules for site plan review, steps in the process for site plan review or subdivision or variances. There is a process for those as well. For each of those, and hopefully those steps are included in your local laws, in your local zoning or your site plan review law or subdivision regulations, and there should be a process delineated there. That process must, at a minimum, meet what's also in statute. So we have statutory requirements related to the process for reviewing those permits as well, but there are discretionary steps that a board can take. So your local laws might have additional steps that you do as a board that the statute doesn't require. So what I would say is making sure you also familiarize yourself with the steps in the process for each of the application reviews as well, and familiarize yourself with statute. And we have a guide to planning and zoning laws of New York State that includes all related laws to any planning and zoning matter. It's broken down by town, village, and city law and general municipal law. And then there's a commentary on the side that provides information in more lay language about what those statutory requirements say, and it's a great document. I've used it my whole career. I used to staff my town planning board and zoning board of appeals as the staff planner, and we used that document all the time before I came to the state. So if you don't have a copy of that, you can get it online, and we can certainly provide you with a link to that, and you can get it on our website. But it does provide a lot of you can quickly look at the process by opening that up, but also you do have to understand what's in your local laws. And then the other thing to understand is, what is the process for application intake at your local level? How does the process unfold? It's important to know that, because you need to know how an applicant arrived before you, because a lot has gone on prior to you going to a board meeting and that applicant standing there. So who intakes the applications in your community? Is it the code enforcement officer or building inspector? Do you have a clerk for your boards that does intake? Maybe it's even the municipal clerk. But understanding who that person is, and whether they're also going to be therefore in charge of interpreting those applications, which would be the zoning enforcement officer or code enforcement officer. They have to decide whether or not what the person wants to do will meet your codes, whether or not it requires site plan review, all of those things. And then you also will need to understand whether or not what you're reviewing will also require other permits. Are there other either permits within, town hall or municipal hall that are going to be required, like driveway permits and maybe permits through DEC, things of that nature, or does it need a zoning variance as well as a special use permit or a site plan review approval? So all of those things do kind of need to be understood up front, and understanding where the roles of staff fall and understanding their capacity and ability to help you is important for communication and understanding responsibilities. One thing that I will say, you know, I was the town planner and I would help intake applications, and I would work very hard with applicants to get them to a point where their application is complete so that by the time they go to the board, they're ready to go. But I personally had no authority to say, your application's incomplete, you can't go before the planning board. So some applicants will just insist that they're all set, they meet the requirements, you know, you're asking too much, I just want to get on that agenda. And at some point I would say, okay, fine, let's put you on an agenda, and then the applicant would go before the board, and you know, and you're communicating with the board, so you're letting the board know that you did ask for additional items, and the applicant, you know, hadn't yet provided those, and then the board can turn around and ask for those things as well. So it's really understanding everybody's role is important, so that you so that when you're moving forward, you know that, okay, if we don't have everything we need, we as a board need to make sure we have a complete application, and we now need to ask that applicant for the missing items. And so, and I pretty much just touched on this a little bit, but working with planning staff and enforcement staff is really important. A lot of folks are part-time or wear a lot of hats. So you do need to, everybody needs to be sensitive to each other's time and ability to work together. But the idea is to have a good process for the applicant. You are somewhat in the business of customer service, but then also making sure that the project before you is what you want to see in your community. So just understanding everybody's roles is really important. And then you should also be familiar with the applications that you have. You should read them in advance. If you're on a board for a while and you feel like you're not getting the information that you need every time somebody comes in, you're kind of asking the same questions over and over again of every applicant because the information just simply isn't asked for on your applications, then as a board, an exercise that you could take on is to update your applications to get a better application that provides you with the information you need up front so that you're not asking for it later. So I would highly encourage you to familiarize yourself with the application, look at the application through the eyes of an applicant and make sure that the questions are clear so that you can all work together to get to a complete application as quickly as possible. If it's not clear to you, it's more than likely not clear to the applicant. Checklists are also a great way to make sure that you're getting all the information you need. You can have a checklist for the applicant at the back of the application, and then when you're looking at what you've received from in your packet, whether or not all the information is there that you had asked for in that checklist, and you can then use that checklist and tracking of submissions as part of your review process. We have a lot of examples of those as well. We have a sample that you could utilize if you don't use checklists or tracking sheets. We do have those, which can be helpful to make sure you're not missing steps in your process, because if you do miss a step in the process and somebody is unhappy with your decision, it's the quickest way to see your decision nullified if it's challenged in court is because you missed a step in your legal process or in the statutory process for review. So familiarizing yourself with all of those things will go a long way to catching those instances where something might accidentally be skipped. A good example of that might be county referrals, which is something that counties do struggle with because sometimes that step is skipped in the process. And then when you're reviewing your application materials, everyone's time is should be respected. So as board members, you know, we always say come to the meeting prepared to do the work, review the applications in advance. Whoever is in charge of making sure that you do receive all the application materials, if it's the chair of the board, if you're not receiving materials in a timely fashion, then that is something that should be addressed, because you should have, you know, a week to review an application. Sometimes applicants will come in with additional information just before a meeting or at a meeting. That happens, that's fine, but a board's procedural process should not be to provide you with materials just a couple days before a meeting or the day of a meeting. You should be given ample time to review the full application and should be given all the meeting materials. We do hear from board members about this being an issue in some communities, so we do know that that can be an issue out there. And then do your homework, come with a list of questions that you might have about the application so that it's hard to remember on the fly what you might have read, you know, when you were looking over the application, so jotting those down. Do a site visit in advance if possible. It's amazing what you think you see on a map. It doesn't look anything like what's really on the ground. Maps always make things, and plats always make things look more spacious than they really are, and then you get to a site and it can be a much smaller situation than it looks like on a map. So site visits are a really important part of the process. Even if you're just getting a sense of things before a formal site visit, you might be able to go down there and sort of check things out without going on a site. And so, again, coming prepared, and if you don't feel like you're being given enough time to review materials, that needs to be communicated, because you should be given at least a week to review things. And then remembering when you're preparing for the meeting that let's see, actually, Paula, is this your
Yeah,
slide?
I'm doing this.
Yeah,
one.
sorry.
All right, so most importantly, again, it's just going over the same things. I feel like we do this a lot in the show. It's open meetings law, notice, and access. The chair usually prepares the agenda and decides the order of the applications. That typically happens, you know, it might be different every time, but might be new versus old business, or maybe if there's something controversial, you maybe put that up front because the media has attended, so you want to kind of get them in and out before they have their own deadlines. The chair or maybe a secretary should make sure to ensure a quorum and use those alternates if you have to. Invite and confirm the appropriate staff and consultants, and maybe your town attorney if you have one of those and you need them there. Schedule the appropriate venue. That means it's usually the same spot, but if you know something is particularly controversial and you have a pretty small room, but people are kind of talking about showing up, you might want to move the venue to a space that's a little bit larger. Ensure all that technology is up and running. Test it before the meeting. Nobody likes when you have to sit there for 5 or 10 minutes while you try to figure out why it's not working. Post your meeting materials, applications, the maps, everything prior to your meeting online so that the public can review the proposals before the board, because that a lot of times is, if it is controversial, people get really hyped up about stuff that they don't necessarily have the intel on. So open government requires us to put that stuff online, do the best you can in terms of posting those materials, but if you're having a public hearing but the public can't actually access the application files, then like how are they really supposed to be able to make a informed, you know, comment at the meeting? So there is a reason why that we put some time into posting those materials online to try and make it a little bit easier for people to understand. You might be a municipality that does pre-meeting workshops. These are subject to open meetings law if you meet as a quorum. And it's really, a lot of times, it's maybe going over the materials for the board just to make sure that applications are complete and ready for board review. And it can also help determine if there's going to be a conflict of interest where you might have to call an alternate in. Don't use these to make those decisions. We had a former colleague who used to say, the board would meet at 6:30 and they'd go through everything and then they'd gavel out and then they'd gavel in for the official meeting at 7 p.m. and say, okay, we did all of the work, and then gavel right back out. The whole point of the spirit of open meetings law is really to do the public's business in front of the public. It doesn't mean they have to speak at the meetings unless you're having a public hearing, but you know, try to be as open as you can about the work that you're doing. Monica kind of just talked about conducting site visits, but again, really important to do, especially I find for not just planning board, but zoning board members as well. Nothing gets you the feeling more than being on site and getting an idea. Go with a clipboard, go observe the application site, refrain from talking about the application even though everybody's nosy neighbor is going to come out and try to give you their opinion about it or ask what you're doing there. Try to ask them that you'll have a public hearing. They can make their comments there at that time. Quorum is, if you have a quorum and you do a site visit together as a board, it's subject to open meetings law. But typically what we see is boards, they either go alone or maybe with one other member, and they don't talk about it. They're just there to kind of see what's going on. And that is not a violation of open meetings law. So when you're conducting your site visits, you might want to consider it two different categories: what's happening on the parcel, subject parcel itself, and then what's happening around it. And again, it's going to be different depending on what application, because every application is different. So some of the questions you might ask yourself: is the property a lot wetter or drier than you thought? Is it good or poor drainage? Any unusual gradients or slopes? Is the neighboring buildings kind of close or far away? Do you see or smell or hear anything unusual? Does the proposed locations for new structures or roads or driveways make any sense? Is there common vegetation or trees? Are there good views from the larger perspective? Is the nearest road intersection easy or hard to get through? Are cars kind of parked in odd ways, or in, is there a lot of traffic? And that's also where you might go at different times of the day. You know, if it's on your busy corridor, most likely it's kind of busy all the time, but if it's residential and it's near school, there might be probably more traffic around the time of drop off and pickup versus like out on a commercial strip. Are there sidewalks? Are they in good condition? Like I said, the questions can be endless, but just kind of go and get a feel of what's happening. All right, Monica's going to talk about the meeting.
All right, so just to touch quickly on quorum, just to remind everyone that a quorum is necessary to conduct any business of the board. So that includes convening meetings, hearings, voting. Any business whatsoever requires a quorum. If you don't, and a quorum is at least a majority of the fully constituted board. That is including any absences or vacancies. So if you are a 7-member board, then you need, well, to do business, you would need 4 members, and then to make a decision, all 4 members would have to essentially vote in the majority, because otherwise you wouldn't have enough votes in the majority, because all 4 members would have to vote for or whatever that action is. So it's really important to not conduct business. And if you have the ability to use alternates, Paula touched on this earlier, which can be used for conflicts of interest. And if addressed in a local law, you can expand that definition to include other forms of absences. For you as board members, if you know you have that language that allows for alternates to be used for other reasons, obviously letting the board chair or whomever know as early as possible that you will be missing a meeting so that they can contact an alternate, or letting them know so that if you're going to miss a meeting, they can decide whether or not they're going to have enough members to hold the meeting. And because if not, it has to be rescheduled if you don't have the ability to use alternates. So giving that information as early as possible can avoid last-minute cancellations of meetings, or, as has happened, showing up at a meeting and not realizing you're not going to have a quorum and not being able to do any business. So that's a good communication skill. Open meetings law, to touch on this quickly, public meetings versus public hearings. A public hearing is the official convening of a public body for the purpose of conducting public business. So any conduct of public business where there's a quorum is a public meeting and should be treated as such. Public meetings are, in terms of how to address and deal with the public can listen and observe, but you're under no obligation to allow them to comment at just the regular meeting. If you have a standard practice of having a public comment time in your agenda, that's fine, that's not required. Regular meeting business is you're there to do business, you're there to work with the applicant, talk to the applicant. It's not, that part of the meeting is not for the public engagement per se. A public hearing, on the other hand, is the official proceeding of a governmental body or officer during which the public is accorded the right to be heard. So this is where you are required to listen to the public when you've opened a public hearing. And the public is anyone, they don't have to be residents of your community. Public hearings are required for all ZBA matters, and then as well as subdivision and special use permits. Site plan review does not require a public hearing in statute, so it's entirely up to local laws whether or not you require one. They are often discretionary, and what we would say here is being consistent about when you use public hearings in a discretionary matter is important, so it doesn't appear that you're treating one applicant different than another. And then when you're conducting public hearings, if you have rules of the road in those local, like in a local bylaw, like we talked about earlier, that explains that during public hearings, people have a certain number of minutes to speak and a process for how those speaking arrangements will go. That's great. If you have that in your rules, you could then put that on the back of your agendas for rules of the road for public hearing situations so that the public knows how those will be handled. That's a good thing to do for any public hearing. It's particularly a good idea if there's a controversial project before you and you know you're going to have a large group at a meeting and you're going to need a good process set up. Having those rules of the road right on those agendas can be helpful. Either way, whether it's a controversial project or not, always be courteous and careful with your body language. The folks sitting in the seats have nothing better to do than stare at you as board members and watch what you're doing and reacting to in a public hearing. Don't be looking at your phone or looking disinterested or reacting to comments. Don't engage the public. It can be really hard not to engage the public into a back and forth. They may even ask you questions. For consistency's sake, you should just say, we're here to listen to what you have to say. This is not a discussion scenario. Because they'll throw out questions to you when they get their minutes to speak. And so try to refrain from doing that engagement. If you do hear a question that you then want to ask of the applicant later in your time as a board, that's fine to get some answers to questions, but try not to engage in a back and forth, although it can be very tempting, to say the least. And then on controversial projects especially, you may have media that's interested in the project, might have gotten sensationalized by neighboring opposition or somebody, bringing the press into something. Sometimes you'll be surprised what the media will pick up on. Projects that seem small and not that big of a deal, might be a light news day. But you should have a policy for how to deal with the media, a point person that is charged with talking to them when there is communication. And remember that they are often in a good position, the media is often in a good position to, if you provide them with information, get the right information out there about a project, because there can be a lot of misinformation about projects. I've experienced that myself multiple times in my community, right down to what the application is even being considered for, what the approval is for. It's not a variance, it's a special use permit, those things. So providing information to the media can actually be really helpful to clear up misinformation. And then from the standpoint of if you think there will be press there and they are controversial projects, considering where you want to put a controversial project on an agenda might be a good idea strategically. Maybe get that one over with first, because that will then allow you to move to other applications without, all the distraction. Or if there's one simple thing on the agenda that could be cleared off, and that then you're going to be, doing a longer agenda item for a considerable amount of time, maybe clearing off that simple agenda item first, and then moving to the other might make more sense. But there is some strategy to that. All right, Paula.
Okay. So making our decisions and getting us through the end of this presentation kind of quickly. So one, don't be afraid to seek assistance. We know that you're not land use experts for the most part. You might need legal and land use assistance. We just want to make sure that you feel comfortable voting on the matters before you, because once a building is there, it's usually there for a while. So you want to make sure that the projects are a really good fit for your community. It's better to ask those questions than approve a project that you really don't understand. We don't want to see that happening. So always ask, don't be afraid. You might have municipal staff and consultants that can help you understand some of the technical complexities of applications. We'll talk. There's actually the Office of the State Comptroller opinion. This allows municipalities to hire their own experts. Those review costs can be charged back to the applicant so long as you have a local law that authorizes that. We utilize that opinion to do so. And your local regulations might already have pre-established fees as a municipal budget item. Sometimes we do this for staff training, so if you really don't understand the complexities of like a very complex stormwater application, you might hire an engineer to like help you through that process with that application, and that's a way of doing that. So there is opportunity out there to get some help when you need it. And that could be things like planners or engineers, architects, surveyors, attorneys. If you're doing things like telling the town board it's time to update our comp plan or our zoning, sometimes you can do some of that in-house, but zoning's pretty intense. So typically we kind of encourage people to hire, specific planners that help you through that process, or attorneys that might help you through that process. Sometimes these people are available to answer some of your questions. Sometimes you have them on staff, like, consulting-wise, so they might come in just when you have a question. Again, it's good to just kind of question what's available to you at your disposal when you kind of come on the board. So if you do hire consultants, remember they're working for the municipality. So if they're working on something like a comprehensive plan, it's always, or something specific that might take a long time, establish a lead contact with the consultant, check in with them regularly, evaluate the work at several intervals, not just at the last stage, because you don't want to go through the process of, we're really not happy about this. Raise those concerns ahead of time. and try to address those issues sooner than later. As planners, we know that sometimes that's the hardest thing, is keeping other consultants like on track sometimes. But be persistent and respectful. But again, remember, you're the client, so sometimes you need to push for what you're kind of really hoping for. Your voting considerations: you have to have a quorum to take a vote. They should take place at the meetings. If you have a member that's recusing, they should really try to leave the room, and the record should reflect why they're recusing. This isn't set in stone, but this is one of those things where if somebody's stepping aside and they might their story might be told on their face, and other members might notice that over the course of an application. So sometimes that's why really leaving the room might sometimes be helpful in that. Make sure that you have your alternates to vote in an application if you're going to have an absence. Findings are really important. They're the analysis, which applies a lot of facts leading to conclusions. The better you do in your findings, the better off you are if you are challenged, which eventually at some point you'll probably be challenged. Sometimes they're drafted by a municipal attorney or the board comes together, but it's looking at what the law is, how an applicant met the standards of your law, or if they're not doing that, what evidence or lack of evidence was presented by the applicant to meet those standards. Relate any facts to conditions that you impose on an application. This will help support your decision if you're challenged in court, and keep these as the record in your application file, which you'll hold on to. The record essentially is just everything that was presented to the board during your proceedings. So it includes the application and plans, drawings, photographs, deeds, surveys, any experts that might have been their reports. You might have a traffic impact study that would be part of it. Any of the correspondence between the applicant and any of your staff at town hall. Your public hearing notice, written comments submitted by members of the public, any municipal records that are submitted during the proceedings, and of course your decision document and those findings. Again, the better job you do on that one is the better off you are when you do get challenged. It's a clean record. It's easy for the court to interpret. So just finishing, of course, the basics, be on time and attend your meetings. Applicants are paying to come before the board, so you want to be respectful of their time. Read the application materials and minutes before the meeting. I am a recovering nonprofit executive director. My board would never read the meeting minutes before the board, and it would drive me crazy because we'd start the meeting with 10 minutes in silence. It was infuriating. So make sure that you're doing your homework beforehand. Seek that staff assistance before the meeting. Get some of those questions answered. Be familiar with the sites and projects before you. Always utilize that comprehensive plan. Know your zoning laws and regulations. Try to stick to the agenda and the schedule. You shouldn't be making decisions, deep in late of night at 11:30 at night or later. You can always table it and move to the next meeting. I always feel like government should never do stuff that late at night. In your meetings, focus on facts and not your personal opinions. Share information, confirm your understanding of the project. Work well with your, be probing but not argumentative. That's with each other as board members, but also with the public as well. Participate in the discussion, respect your associates, be conscious of your body language. Treat everyone equally, don't make it personal, don't get into fights, in the parking lot after the meeting. I know sometimes tempers can flare at these things, but try to remember, it's only happening here. I can go home afterwards and unwind. And finally, this is the intel on how to get in touch with us if you do have questions over the course of your sitting on the board. And thank you for volunteering your time to your municipalities. We know it's really hard work. It's often thankless. So we appreciate you coming for training, And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have before we wrap this up. Don't all jump at once.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but I wanted to say thank you for this really terrific presentation. It was great and comprehensive. I'm really looking forward to seeing the recording on YouTube for everyone else who wasn't able to attend with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll get that over to you in the next couple days.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Hopefully we'll see you in Corning sometime soon.
Okay. Bye.
Have a good
Bye.
day.
Thanks for showing up.